Right, so whilst it is so easy to become distracted by the conflict between Israel and Iran, not only because of fears of that conflict widening, but because after 20 months of watching Israel get away with genocide with impunity, and they're now getting a taste of their own medicine, we can't take our eyes off Gaza whilst that is also going on, because nothing has changed there either. Israel's genocide is still ongoing. And if you don't acknowledge that, don't keep that in mind, don't keep speaking out about it, then Israel gets another win. And if Gaza becomes sidelined as they want it to become, Israel having said Iran is their primary focus now and Gaza is now secondary, so much for their own hostages in which case, then Israel can get away with much worse, and they are getting much worse there. Aid distribution centres have become ever increasingly death zones. The criticism for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is entirely justified, when given it is financed by Mossad and isn't a US-owned Swiss-based NGO at all. In reality, regardless of who claims to be the CEO or where it chooses to be registered, it very much bears that out. They aren't aid hubs, these Gaza distribution centres. They're slaughterhouses. And when other aid workers and aid agencies are refusing to work with them on that basis, places not of benefit to people but of butchery, it's little wonder they are being referred to in at least one instance as human abattoirs now. Right, so where aid agencies like UNRWA once delivered the essential aid needed for the captive population of the illegally occupied Gaza Strip, this has now been done away with thanks to their Israeli captors, hasn't it? Now they run the aid distribution points too. Sure, they're supposed to be managed by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, aren't they? The GHF, which is supposedly a US-based NGO that is registered in Switzerland. But it didn't take very long for it to come out that it is very much Israeli by design and financed by Mossad. Equally, it didn't take very long for that scheme to become completely discredited either, having turned what are supposed to be places of aid distribution into execution zones instead. Surveillance drones hover overhead, metal fencing cordon the desperate tightly into restrictive queues. CCTV is in operation, and day after day as the IDF, or Israel's financed and supported terrorist food thieves led by Yasser Abu al-Shabaab, treat hopeless Gazans queuing for food as targets instead. These were meant to be sanctuaries, places where people could get the aid they desperately need, yet they become slaughterhouses, literal human abattoirs. All of this has gone on whilst our attention has been shifted, of course, hasn't it? Our gaze now becoming increasingly fixed on the mounting conflict between Israel and Iran. But while headlines debate what Donald Trump is going to do amidst his flip-flopping but no less tub-thumping rhetoric and missile threats aimed at Iran, and people are in equal measure horrified yet fascinated by Iran giving Israel as good as it gets, if not more so, the streets of Gaza have not ceased to be witness to further acts of Israeli atrocity. Where was the outrage when on the 14th of June dozens of aid seekers were gunned down and more than half of that day's Palestinian deaths occurred at GHF sites? Where was the mainstream media just yesterday when 70 Gazans, children, mothers, fathers were killed in Khan Yunis, the deadliest mass slaughter at a food distribution centre yet? And an unprecedented admission by Israeli forces made that official too, admitting that they were indeed responsible for that. From the moment the GHF was unveiled, we knew it was going to be bad news though. We already had the likes of UNRWA delivering aid and more besides, and had done for a significant length of time, successfully. That Israel suddenly claimed UNRWA, a literal UN aid agency, was now Hamas, was readily planned by those in the know as more Israeli lies and nonsense. The world leaders just nodded as they always do, didn't they? Take Israel's lies as gospel truth, like they always do. And so the GHF has functionally taken over and just turned aid into an all-new weapon at Israel's disposal. And all those who allowed this to happen can say is, Israel has a right to defend itself. According to reports, GHF-run aid sites were designed with sand berms and wire fencing, ostensibly to manage crowds or add security. But in reality, these rendered Gazans exposed and stationary, perfect targets, therefore. Eyewitnesses described scenes of horrific carnage from day one, aid turned into a trap, Palestinians being shot just for showing up. By the 14th of June, only weeks after these sites opened, at least 130 people had been killed at them. Killed at the various GHF facilities, and well, just reading off that number is easy to do, isn't it? That's 130 individual tragedies. Each is a family being torn apart. Where Israelis claim to have been fearing for their lives, there is a rush of people coming at them for food, desperate people, starving as they were, as they have stated. These people were not armed, and the Israelis very much were. The people they are apparently so afraid of that they feared for their lives despite having guns in their hands, among those counted amongst the dead, which have included pregnant women and toddlers. On the 17th of June, 70 people were gunned down and hundreds wounded in the worst massacre in any GHF site to date. Israel confirmed responsibility because of course they did. They fear no repercussions over it, do they? Let that sink in. The government admitting it executed innocent people queuing for food. It's beyond grim. They always get away with it. Palestinian lives are cheap when Israel has a right to defend itself, as we keep being told. Well, it doesn't, not against a captive population whose land they illegally occupy, but that never gets raised in our mainstream media, does it? Our politicians never get challenged on that, do they? Aid queues meant to keep civilians alive have become targets of choice. The world just ends up shrugging its shoulders. The GHF was launched with high-profile American backing, of course, wasn't it? But cracks showed fast, as I've mentioned before in other videos. Jake Wood, the ex-Marine veteran, resigned as CEO on the launch day, citing inhumane practices he couldn't morally endorse. The Boston Consulting Group, who conceptualized the GHF, refused to participate over ethical concerns later on and withdrew as well. Their departures launched a domino effect, experienced teams walking away, aid groups stepping away from the GHF if they ever had anything to do with them to begin with, all fearing complicity. To replace Jake Wood stepped in Johnny Moore, an American evangelical with no NGO track record at all, but ties to Trump, to right-wing US politics, and of course he's an avowed Zionist, as so many Christian evangelicals seem to be. Aid was steered to South and Central Gaza by the GHF, leaving northern residents trapped with dwindling supplies and no security. This maldistribution mirrors the ethnic cleansing goals of Israel, who cleared the north before and would like to do so again, and are using aid as a carrot to do so, becoming a lethal stick to too many who tried to end up claiming it. Aid became a velocity vector for displacement, therefore, food and water in one direction only. Other aid organisations refused to work with GHF from the get-go, which brings us back to UNRWA, though not the wider UN, as it happens, who are still expressing sorry and regret, or sitting on their hands and doing sod all to stop it. The UN distancing itself, despite UNRWA head Chris Gunness condemning aid sites as human abattoirs. That phrase came from the literal head of UNRWA, and it underscores what a toxic entity the GHF is. Official tallies now claim 55,000 Palestinian deaths since Israel invaded Gaza following the Hamas incursion of October 7, 2023. And of course it's women and children making up the vast majority of that statistic still. According to the OCHA, more than 80% of Gaza has now been designated a militarized zone by Israel now, crowding 2 million people into just 20% of the Gaza Strip now. Since February's ceasefire collapse, some 665,000 more Palestinians have been illegally displaced, uprooted, all of which constitute and meet the terms of genocide under the Genocide Convention. War crimes all. And yet still all we hear from too many of our Western leaders is that Israel has a right to defend itself. Forced movement, collapsing services, starvation. This is the genocide playbook enacted by Israel, and it's still only they seemingly have that right to defend themselves. UNICEF has also stepped in and warned that acute malnutrition is killing Gaza's children at frightening rates as malnourished bodies succumb to treatable infections. Children are the most susceptible to this. Therefore, Israel's war of starvation targets children more than anyone else. Only 10% of needed food is entering Gaza, according to reports, with claims being made that more bombs than food enter the Strip. This is the grim reality of life there. In addition to all of this, the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian zones continues. Siege tactics, prevented evacuation, targeted starvation, all constitute genocide under that convention. Add to that the direct killing at those aid sites as aforementioned, and the picture becomes clearer and all the more chilling. On the 14th of June, half of Gaza's deaths that day that were reported occurred at GHF-run aid centres. Starvation camps turned into kill fields. So the uncomfortable truth is that this is not collateral damage at all. It's a deliberate tactic being enforced by Israel day after day. If the world's eyes are on Iran, and only Iran now, it is because geopolitics is easier and the story fits neatly. A nuclear standoff, regional brinkmanship. But Gaza is bloodied and battered. It's a story of state violence and genocide. Your heads of state, Western parliaments, global news outlets, the mainstream media have been far louder over quotes from Tehran than cries from Gaza. At their recent meeting, the G7 lauded Israel's right to self-defense. Again, our Western leaders for you, rancid every last one of them, while ignoring the daily slaughter of aid seekers. They called out Iran for destabilising the Middle East, all while Israel literally dropped bombs on aid lines. It's a geopolitical theatre of the absurd and the bought and paid for. Europe's foreign policy chief admitted the EU hasn't done enough, but no concrete measures, no embargoes, no sanctions, no legal referrals, no nothing were proposed still. Words, not actions, all the time. It's all we forget, isn't it? The EU's mea culpa is more of a mean nothing. At a press conference, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned recent aid-sided massacres, and frankly, I've said it before, I'm heartily sick of watching this guy wringing his hands over this. Do something about it. You can override the permanent vetoes of the UN Security Council being issued at the hands by the US. So how about you do something bold and meaningful for once? The narrowing geography, only south and central Gaza having the food, water and medics, drives people into zones of destruction. If they stay north, they starve or die. If they move south, they may be killed instead still. But what a wonderful choice is put before them. But Israel has a right to defend itself. We're never allowed to forget that, are we? That artificial division equals forced displacement, and that is squarely on the GHF. And under the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, such displacement is criminal. Aid has become bait. Hunger has become a weapon. The GHF is guilty of war crimes in and of itself. In real wars, collateral damage is tragic, but generally limited as much as possible. But this isn't a war in Gaza, it is a genocide. Therefore, children are systematically targeted, not as incidental victims, but deliberate targets, all as a mechanism of control, as a deliberate tactic. Aid-starved, killed when they reach beyond the fences, they represent nothing else than a genocidal calculus. Beyond armed forces, there are the reports of the gangs financed by Israeli resources, some linked to ISIS no less, raiding GHF trucks, diverting supplies, terrorising civilians. The result is more bombs and less bread for the civilian population. Aid not just siphoned away, but weaponized. Countries supplying arms to Israel while killing civilians are effectively co-perpetrators. The US, the UK, Germany, France. What are they waiting for? Oh, they were all at the G7, weren't they, congratulating themselves for calling out Iran and attacking Iran and telling us that Israel has a right to defend itself. It's a broken record now. Thousands are dead, thousands more displaced and starving. The arms embargo, not even a whisper. The ICC, who's even trying to enforce those arrest warrants. The ICJ, interim measures ignored despite a plausible case for genocide having been proven, getting on for a year and a half ago now. It is worse than impotence, it is abject surrender to political expedience, and it's got to end. GHF operations must cease immediately pending true humanitarian oversight and aid ceded back to UNRWA under UN peacekeeping protection and enforcement. UN-run aid corridors must be deployed, accessible to all of Gaza, north, central and south. Military escorts and clear demilitarised routes must be established along with protection guarantees for medics, volunteers and journalists who must be allowed in too. Impose an arms embargo that actually means it on Israel supplying airframes, munitions, tech, anything frankly that they could be using in these massacres and their atrocities. Targeted sanctions on political and military officials responsible. Freeze their assets. Establish travel bans, just like Israeli officials currently have on their own civilian population as Iran bombs them. Launch a full international criminal investigation into the GHF and Israel's targeting of civilians. Use independent prosecutors to do that. Pressure governments and mainstream media to cover what is going on in Gaza properly, or better still, just use independent media who don't need to be shamed into doing so. Gaza is still happening even as we watch videos across social media and Iran's missiles falling on Israel. Gaza is still being subjected to a genocide, under the eyes of the world and at the heart of humanitarian perversion. The GHF, far from being a saviour of the starving, has become an apparatus used to execute them. Hundreds of people killed for coming for food. They didn't need to die. Israel chose to do that. If we let our attention drift because another war narrative is a little bit shinier, Israel will use that to their own advantage, and those people we have felt for and called for justice for the last 20 months will have now been let down by us. Every bullet fired into a crowd seeking aid is a vote to sideline their humanity. It's bad enough our leaders and media ignore this without us all joining them in it. Meanwhile, in an all other news, an all-new Freedom Flotilla mission is preparing to set sail, but again, it's getting very little fanfare. Perhaps because there's no Greta Thunberg this time, so it's not as shiny a story this occasion. Who knows? But check out that story here in this video recommendation as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.